Well, colleagues, welcome everybody to the presentation of the master's thesis of two of our candidates. And I'm quite happy to say that the standard of the research that has been performed by these two candidates are very, very high. And the impact also is something that we're quite excited about. I'm going to hand over to Francois Burman, our first candidate, and he's going to present his thesis, and he did a retrospective review of all the safety aspects of clinical hyperbaric facilities that are used in remote areas for treating of divers, and specifically looking at what are the most common safety concerns. So for us as doctors, it's quite an important thesis, because if we take responsibility for these things, we need to know what are the common things that occur that we need to address to make sure that the facility is safe. It is an open forum, and we want to keep the discussion open so that the information can be made available. So if there's something that needs clarification, you can ask the candidates. I was the supervisor for both the candidates, so if there's other things that I need to clarify as well, you're more than welcome to ask me as well. And then afterwards, we will have an opportunity for discussion as well. So if it's something that needs clarification there and then I think you can ask. But I've specifically scheduled some time afterwards for questions. So if it can wait, we'd prefer for it to wait afterward. All right, thanks. Francois.
Thank you, Jack. Well, Jack kind of stole my thunder with the first slide and explained to you what the work is that I did. So I was half tempted to ask if you didn't want to continue with the rest of it, Jack. This has been a life's work for the last actually 15 or 16 years now. France can attest to it because it was a process we started several years ago together. So what I will be speaking about and presenting, the work that I did in the last 2 or 3 years in the MSc program, has been very much a real work that we've done out in the field, and the results that we've got for the field are actual, real. They're not statistics or they're not generated data, but it's actually real data that we worked with. So, seeing that Jack gave you what the thesis is all about, looking at the common safety concerns at a range of international hyperbaric facilities, the focus that we have, or that I had, was on facilities treating injured recreational divers. But clearly facilities don't only treat injured recreational divers. Many of them are established to treat medical applications, or they're military chambers or commercial diving chambers. So they have many other things that they treat at the same time. Our focus was to see whether these facilities were safe for treating injured recreational divers. And one needs to say that up front, because a recreational diver is essentially an injured person, a patient. A commercial diver or a military diver has a lot more training, it knows what to expect in these chambers, and what we're essentially doing is putting in a novice into a fairly uncomfortable, different environment. And from the medical side of it, we want to make sure that those patients get as much calming, they must feel that they're patients. They're not some commercial diver or military diver that's expected to lie on a hard board for a period of 4.5 hours just because that's the way it's done. The process really started, and I'm going to give you some background as to how we got to really getting to the data. In about 1998, although it actually preceded that, I was asked by the International Divers Alert Network to come up with some scheme that the doctors could gain confidence that when they do a referral to a remote chamber, and I say clearly remote chamber, meaning a chamber, if you can think in your mind's eye, that is stuck on an island somewhere, doesn't have infrastructure, doesn't maybe have the best medical background and support to it. So it's a facility that is rudimentary, at least. And now, using what we would call today telemedicine, a diving medical officer working for any organization has to make a medical referral to a fairly rudimentary chamber. And that doctor wants to know, well, what am I saying? Where am I sending the patient to? Is it possibly better to send the patient to a hospital somewhere and ignore the chamber, or should I send them to the chamber for recompression therapy? So the International Divers Alert Network asked me specifically if I could come up with a way of providing some form of quality assurance and safety assurance for them. Now, there are many existing guidelines, and I've put them up over there. They don't present too well on the screen at the moment, and I'm going to go through them just to give you an idea as to what existed at the time. But in essence, there was, and even today, there still isn't anything other than what we've done in the form of a step-by-step process to give you confidence. There are many standards that give you compliance-type approaches. So you either comply or you don't comply. But they don't identify the risks that will differ between different facilities. And that's always been the big drawback looking at codes and standards. Just allow me to talk a little bit about these here. This one doesn't show very well, but that's the Germanische Lloyd certification society rule for the insurance of a ship. So what's it got to do with diving? Well, a diving system is built into a ship. And Germanische Lloyd, as an international insurance and classification company, believe that diving systems on a ship can actually negatively influence the safety of the ship, and they believe that specific rules for diving systems are required so that you can maintain your insurance on your vessel. That's one of about 7 certification society rules, and we clearly went to them to start with to find out what is out there in the industry, even though the focus is clearly on commercial divers. And most of the time, using Germanische Lloyd, you're not treating an injured person, you are actually doing commercial diving, you're pressurizing, saturating, desaturating, and dealing with occupational issues, not even medicine. But it's clearly referred to, and it has become the cornerstone to many people of what is out there. This one represents what the navies use, and different navies have different rules. The US Navy is a very good repository of about 60 or 70 years of their development of their diving technology. Without wanting to detract from our own Navy over here, the navies are not generally up to date. The information they use is normally well-founded. They've had many, many years of developing something, so they're around about 10 years behind where one would currently be in terms of practices now. But all the history is there, very good information on redundancy, things that can go wrong when the ship is at sea, and the maintenance regimen really comes from a document like that. Then the UHMS, the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society in the United States, represents the largest body of clinical and diving medical doctors. And they have 2 specific guidelines out, one for monoplace chambers and one for multiplace chambers, and I'll clarify what I mean by those chambers a bit later. But they had a set of essentially occupational rules, how you should practice the medicine, and with reference to the equipment, but nothing really tangible that you can extract out of there to use as quality assurance on a remote diving facility. This publication over here, Jacek, are you following okay there?
Yes, absolutely. I have slides.
Okay. The NFPA 99 actually represents about the best we can get, and it's gone through many iterations since about 1970 when it came into play. It's a healthcare facilities. It was a standard. This is the first time it's become a code in 2012. And it, to some extent, starts looking at the operational issues rather than purely at the technical issues. But the focus on NFPA, and excuse me for reiterating this, but it's important to understand, is the F. It's on fire prevention. So even though it's a good hyperbaric standard, the focus is where are the fire risks and how can we deal with the fire risks, and those are not the only risks that we have to face. And then there are a range of other codes and standards that give us all the engineering stuff, the design of the chamber, the design of the windows, how we design pressure receivers and so on. That stuff is fairly well known. The US has taken it a little bit further and actually developed a standard for hyperbaric facilities, because that's what that's called, looking at now, in the latest version, medicine, as well as diving, and as well as aerospace industry. But it focuses, again, purely on the structure. So what equipment you need to have in place, and again, that can vary all over the world. Our remote facilities are not based in the United States. They're based, and I'll show you a map later, in the Caribbean, which is trying to think of the Afrikaans word, a mengelmoes, but it's a mishmash of French, Dutch, American, Spanish, Portuguese, and many different nationalities, and so they get their codes and standards and practices and regulations from their parent countries. So in the Caribbean, it's like a mini world on its own. You find all the different nationalities and a big range in terms of codes and standards and practices, if any of those actually exist. So what do you do with all this information? And I'm going to jump to the next slide, although I want to just keep your attention on that book up over there. Instead of doing this by blind compliance, and that is the way that the UHMS in America has gone with this, they've decided it's too difficult to have to rationalize our issues. Let us just produce a list of 3,000 items, and you tick those items off, and if you comply with enough of those items, and if you don't, then you need to fix them. This is not going to work when you're dealing with multinationals all over the world, different levels of funding, different levels of awareness, different levels of utilization. It would be impossible to do. So following on what they were doing in the early 90s in Australia, where they were saying it's not enough just to look at the pressure vessel, you need to actually give us a risk assessment. So where is that vessel going to be used? And I'm not talking about a hyperbaric chamber, I'm talking about all pressure vessels. Where is that pressure vessel going to be used, and what do you need to do to make sure that it's going to be used safely? And that's the approach that we took in the risk assessment for hyperbaric facilities. And that allows us, if we're going to look at the very real risks that happen, or that might occur, that could occur at these chambers, then you have a chance of actually addressing all the safety issues. If you're going to do it on blind compliance, You can miss some things, and you can be completely blinded by the fact that you're trying to tick boxes. But if you're looking at what are the things that can go wrong on site, you have a far better chance of actually picking the things up, the essential things. And the risk assessment guide, I'm going to go back one slide, which I don't normally like to do, we put into a publication, first published in about 2000, and it's been improved as we've learned new things, but not substantially, just in terms of adding some of the detail. It provides us a systematic approach to look at an individual chamber and an individual nationality with different types of staff, and yet still focus on what the real risks are. We won't talk about risk assessment now, other than saying that we know in a hyperbaric chamber, in a hyperbaric environment, we have a series of operational hazards, and they're listed here. What is unique is that we have some fairly unique issues, such as the exposure to high pressure. We have very specific fire explosion issues. We have a very restrictive operating environment, and the best way for me to explain this, especially when I'm talking to people that are coming into this new, is when the chamber door is closed, especially on a big chamber, you don't have 3 seconds to get back inside there. It's going to take you 6 minutes to be able to get that patient out. So if something goes wrong, you have a long time before you can actually react. In many of these multi-place chambers, we have CCTVs, but they don't pick up everything, or we have small windows and you cannot physically see inside the chamber. So it is very difficult to know exactly what's going on inside the chamber, behind the chamber, and once the door is closed, you've got a period of time before you can get in there. Then we have a range of mechanical and physiological or health issues that we're concerned about. We're going to talk about those as I go through the presentation. And then we have potentially dangerous machinery. We have high-pressure cylinders, we have compressors, lots of electrical equipment, and we have concerns in a normal occupational sense. What is unique about our environment is that these all occur in every hyperbaric facility in tandem with each other. So we can't isolate one and say, let's get rid of this. We have to deal with all of these issues at the same time every time we have an excursion. A little bit of basic theory on risk assessment, and this is a definition that is very, very widely used. No one's claimed responsibility for it. But in essence, a risk is a state of uncertainty. It's the probability or the likelihood that some exposure to a hazard is going to lead to negative consequences. And so we don't look at a risk in isolation as being a potential hazard. A risk is the combination of that potential hazard, the chance of somebody becoming exposed to that hazard, and leading to a negative consequence. So it's fairly complicated in trying to then assess what the risk is. And part of the challenge of this thesis, this project, was to design a weighting system that you could then compare your risks and then actually decide which ones are more important, which ones are less important, and they'd be based on things like probability, exposure, and consequence. What we're dealing with in a hyperbaric environment really is the fact that we have a risk that results from an exposure to a hazard. We have people that we're concerned about, and that's always been our primary focus. A little bit less on the equipment, but certainly on the patient, on the staff, and on the passers-by, people that work in surrounding areas. And I don't need to say this for this audience, I'm sure, but when we do, and we have had a few chamber explosions, if a chamber explodes, it doesn't just affect the people in that area, it will affect the entire healthcare facility. It is fairly dramatic when chambers do actually blow up. I have a red light on there. That doesn't mean anything, does it? Okay. Just went from green to red. Just have a look at a couple of hazards, and I'm not going to bore you with the whole lengthy process here. It doesn't present too badly. Jacek will be very clear on your presentation. But here's a very typical remote hyperbaric chamber where they believe they're really set up to deal with almost any diving emergency. And I have to climb inside these chambers and have a look and try to explain to them basic things like trying to close that door when the patient's lying on a mattress is impossible. So the patient has a problem and the doctor needs to lock inside that chamber and the patient is not compliant, it's very difficult to actually get in there. But if nothing else, you can see some complexity, although not a lot of equipment in there, but very restrictive in terms of nature. I'll show you some pictures of much bigger chambers, but about at least 60% of remote chambers are about 54 inches in diameter. It's very small, very restrictive for people to work in. The Navy's, that's the backbone of the Navy, it's a backbone of commercial diving, but it's not really suitable when you're dealing with a patient. Two other dramatic pictures showing you the windows. These are the portholes we use to look inside the chamber. And the scary thing about this is you will go to a facility, and this was about 2005 when I was at this particular facility, and explain to them what caused that, and explain to them that that's an accident waiting to happen, and I can guarantee you today that they still don't get the message and that window is still in service. So it shows you on the engineering side we've over-designed, but on the understanding of the risks, the people operating these chambers really don't understand fully what they're dealing with. This is a bit more modern, And I put this up really to illustrate that I was very aware the whole time I was gathering the information. This is long before this turned into a master's thesis, of the Hawthorne effect. That when I'm dealing with people at a facility, they're going to be trying to explain to me the whole time why it's not an issue. Because they know they're under the spotlight to some extent. They always have reasons. And the doctor in this particular chamber said to me, "You'd never seen that before. This must be brand new." I don't argue with it with the doctors or the staff on site, but I was pulling off sellotape that had been stuck there maybe about a year before to stop some of the leaks. Both cases, it's caused by a simple external light source that is too hot for the window and caused the window to melt. But fairly dramatic. Just worthwhile noting, and it's not really part of this thesis, but the mechanical design is such that we still have never yet had a window like this blow out during a remote recompression. We've had 1 or 2 commercial diving failures, but we've never had a failure in the issue of where we're teaching recreational divers. And then just lastly, I call this the stupid slide. This shows you the safety valve on a hyperbaric chamber. Every pressure vessel, by law, must be fitted with a safety valve. The safety valve is essentially a spring on top of a little seat. The pressure is at the bottom, and when the pressure at the bottom is stronger than the spring force, the seat lifts up and it blows out. Now, one of the hazards we have with a safety valve is when it blows out with a lot of force. And so this enterprising chamber thought that they would hide the force that face it back down into the chamber. The problem is they screwed it into the inlet. So that's the outlet there. So the pressure in the chamber will push with the spring and make sure that that actually never opens. But again, ignorance, they thought they were addressing one risk, and meanwhile they were actually making the situation far worse. Those are easy things to fix. Right, so we have heaps of information. We have, at this stage, 13 years of data, and it was time to gather this data, to assimilate the data and see what it actually told us in terms of the common findings. And that was essentially the main thrust as we started the project. So I took 105 assessment reports. That's 105 facilities that had been assessed, and obviously had the notes and photos for when I wasn't quite sure as to how to categorize the things. And the first step was to have a look at what are the safety concerns. What was very useful at this stage was I had 105 reports written very consistently following this risk assessment guide, so that essentially the first 55 pages all look exactly the same, and after that there were just recommendations. So I knew the information was very consistently put together. But the trick was to look at how to find a scoring system that would allow us to then compare these things on a relative scale, not on an absolute scale, but on a relative scale. Once we have that information, then we can have a look at what are the correlating factors, meaning geographical location, age, utilization, various other things that are non-judgmental. They're not judging the chamber in any way, but they're certainly of interest to the referring physician to know what type of chamber do they have, are they open 24 hours a day, do they have a medical doctor full-time, are their staff properly trained, and so on. And the idea was to correlate the risk that one could see at a facility with those associated factors. And then thirdly, as we went through the thesis, we found that we could actually come up with a predictive model using linear regression that can allow us to then take an unknown chamber in our broader population group and asking 4 very straightforward questions, have a fairly high level of confidence as to what the safety level would be at that particular facility. This illustrates the spread of the chambers. We can talk at length about many issues here, but the main diving areas in the world, if you look at the statistics, are here in the Caribbean, around the Red Sea, where the Polish guys get very involved, right, Jacek? And in Southeast Asia. I have to tell you, and I just marked in the thesis, that there is a fair amount of diving done in the Asia Pacific on the other side, on the east side of Australia, but due to some degree of political complexity of the network that owns the chambers there, they were not willing to allow us to come and actually engage with those particular facilities. But looking at, I've seen a few of the facilities, they look exactly as you'd expect any of the other remote chambers to look. So that was the only real gap, was in this area around about here. That represents Papua New Guinea, so that's about as far east as we went, and California and Cabo San Lucas in Mexico about as far west as we went. That represents the Galapagos Islands, which is interesting in itself, as to get an injured diver from Galapagos to the nearest proper healthcare facility on the mainland would be at least 2 boat rides, a taxi ride, and 2 flights to get them to a mainland hospital. So it's a very remote area. Fortunately, they have now 2 chambers located in the Galapagos. Okay, so what do we do with this data, and how do we actually put this stuff together? Well, the methodology that we followed was to take each of the reports, to extract from the reports, firstly, what are the associated factors, so the geography, the age, the utilization, medical supervision, the basically 12 different factors that we looked at, and to then capture what we call the safety concerns. What are the risks that haven't necessarily been addressed correctly at each of those facilities? And the information was captured in a simple yes or no form for everything. And I then essentially populated a spreadsheet, locked the spreadsheet that was our source data, and from that, want to take the data and actually go and analyze it. Just to give you a visualization of what it is, I have a bunch of associated factors. I have a whole list of chambers that are just numbered, they're de-identified, and then I had 82 different safety concerns that we saw were on the broad spectrum, the most common safety concerns of these chambers, and we essentially went along and said, at this particular facility, what are the safety concerns we've identified? So we had about 16,000 bits of data by the time the collation was finished. I did promise to explain a little bit about what we talk about in chamber terminology. That's probably the best representation of a remote recompression chamber that's well maintained, as you can see, neat and tidy, very basic, very rudimentary, very uncomfortable to climb into, both for the patient and for the medical practitioner or for the attending staff. Very basic control panel, but certainly able to do the job in at least 60 to 70% of the cases. If you have a really critically ill diver, you're not going to send the diver to the chamber, you're going to send the diver to the hospital and make a medical decision later on. In contrast to that, we have a chamber like this, which is typical of the modern technology, and Europe and the States tend to lead with this. We assess this chamber as part of one of the whole bigger mix, because they treat a lot of injured divers, and it's good to get a comparison between a very rudimentary chamber and a large chamber. This one can treat up to 16 patients at a time, but when we take that into consideration, that would be 16 clinical hyperbaric medical patients, not 16 divers. You would generally not tend to treat more than 2 or 3 divers maximum at a time. That's what we call a multi-place chamber. A multi-lock chamber, meaning multiple people, and usually the ability for a doctor or attendant to lock themselves in and to deal with a medical emergency. On the other hand, we have what we call the monoplace chambers, being caused of a lot of, what's the right word now? Controversy in some areas. Some people believe they are absolutely suitable. Some people believe they are absolutely unsuitable to treat an injured diver. You can see it's fairly small, fairly restricted. If something goes wrong with a diver, the question is always how quickly can we actually get to that person to attend to them. But the reality is there's a lot of divers have been treated. We've had a lot of experience in South Africa. We treat divers in this particular unit with monoplace chambers. And when you review the literature, there's a fair amount written on both monoplace and multiplace chambers. It's not about the chamber. It's about the medical supervision, the commitment of the staff, and the ability of the practitioner to decide how they're going to treat that particular person, not the chamber design. But for those of you that might not have seen what these chambers look like, that's a typical multiplace chamber, and that's a typical monoplace chamber. These tend to be mostly found in medical facilities, and that's typical of a remote chamber that might be located at a diving club, might be located at a diving store. Sometimes it's based on an outbuilding of a clinic somewhere on an island, but generally they tend to be outside of full-scale medical supervision and a medical hospital. Okay, no questions yet. Okay, looking at the data, and actually it was a very interesting process to follow, because some of it I knew where we were going to go, but some of it only became evident once we actually got to doing the data analysis. The first thing was to decide how, on a relative scale, to compare, forget about the chambers, to how to compare the risk elements and see which ones are the more important ones and which ones are the less important ones. And I mentioned earlier about how we define a risk and how we actually go about quantifying the magnitude of a risk. Well, first of all, there has to be some likelihood that we're going to have an exposure. So one has to see and has to measure somehow the probability of that. And then if it does happen, how extreme is the result going to be? Is it going to be negligible, or is it going to cause us death and destruction? And I hate to use words like that, but that's essentially what happens. What is unique in a hyperbaric facility that we can't simply go to occupational medicine and occupational risk assessment and use many of the other models is we have different categories of risks. And not only that, we have one that stands out as being the most important risk, and history has shown us, and there was a very well-written up paper that came out in about 96 called a 73-year analysis of chamber fires. There were 80 different fires in chambers over that 73-year period, and we can see that we definitely have a risk that we have to deal with, and it continues to happen, and we have chamber fires probably every 2 or 3 years still to this day. We don't know all of them, because sometimes in some of the countries they won't give us the figures, but generally if it happens in the States, if it happens in South Africa, if it happens in other countries, we get to hear about it. So what we did is we essentially decided, let's have a look at the fire risk. So what is the probability of a fire, the probability of something happening to a person, they're being injured in the process, and what are the mechanical hazards, the restrictive nature, the mechanical nature, running out of gas, a whole range of mechanical concerns. And so we essentially did 3 different magnitude assessments. So we took the probability of each of those, multiplied by the severity of each of those, and then the part that the thesis introduced that was really unique is we could see how often does this really happen around the world. It's not a question of theory anymore, but we could get the frequency of occurrence from how often do these infringements happen at these real chambers. So these 2 over here give us to some extent theory, and I used a 5-point Likert scale to evaluate it. So it's a semi-qualitative, it's not an absolute value. But this, we could see from the statistics what we really had in terms of frequency. These tell us whether they happen or not. As a result, some of the things that we tend to think are the biggest hazards, when you look at the frequency of occurrence, become complete non-issues. And other things, we'll see the examples later on, that we think are really negligible, if you look at how often they happen, there's a far greater likelihood that we can have an accident as a result of those. The frequency that we looked at is we had to look at how many facilities around the world did we have this potential risk being exposed. And I then took the number divided by the total number of facilities, which is 105, and I could get a percentage, a frequency percentage. So it's purely how often at all of these 105 facilities do we have an issue with the safety valve. And we have 55 issues with the safety valve. So it becomes real. So now we know at least 50% of the time this exposure is happening.
The frequency of the occurrence of the risk,
yes.
Not the actual event
not the
that
event.
The risk represents.
So it's the frequency of exposure, not the frequency of outcome.
Yeah.
Yes.
Speaking
so it's assessing the risk rather than the
operation. Yeah. Yeah, the practice. Huh? Yeah. Okay, and with that data, essentially, there were 2 scores. The first score was intuitive. We understood, and the whole process was looking at finding a risk score, and I defined a risk score meaning how important is that individual safety element. So if we have a safety valve, we know the percentage, we know the severity, the probability, and we can get a relative rating of safety valve infringement over the spectrum of all the risks that we're looking at. We call that the safety, the risk score. So that's looking at the risk element itself. However, and this is what came out of the data during the analysis, if you then add all the risk scores up per facility, you can then come out with a risk assessment score for that facility, and you can now relatively compare the facilities with each other. And the moment you can do that, you can then look at all of your associated factors and start statistically analyzing what sort of impact those safety factors have on your facility. So it gets a bit confusing, a bit tongue-tying, and one has to be careful how you say it, but a risk score looks at the relative importance of that risk in terms of risks themselves, and the risk assessment score looks at where that chamber fits in the spectrum. And again, I have to say this is relative assessment. It's only relative to the population that we're actually analyzing. It's not absolute in any term. We then tabulated the risk scores to get an idea of which are the largest. And I'm not really concerned about size. It's more a question of which are the important ones. And once we know which are the important risks, the idea was then to analyze, to research, and to write up those particular elements and be able to give the medical practitioner the background so that they can become convinced that it's important, and then how to actually remedy it. So not just pick out holes, but actually find solutions to the issues. We did categorize them in terms of technical versus human interface issues. That's always been something we've spoken about and made the point about, but never really had a chance to show in the statistics. But technically speaking, most hyperbaric facilities, even if they were built 60 years ago, as long as they haven't been neglected for maintenance, are unlikely to cause an event. The biggest risk we have is the human interface. And that's because our training is not always adequate, because the complacency factor that comes in. And actually the largest reason for human issues at these remote chambers is staff turnover. So the facility is built with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of investment from the local community. Everybody's motivated to treat people. Then you find they treat 4 or 5 patients per year. The staff then move on, and 3 or 4 or 5 years later, it's a completely different batch of staff, and they have no idea really what they're doing. Just a couple of pictures, and again, I apologize, I don't show too clearly. This is actually a very telling picture. That's the inside of a control panel on a typical remote chamber. That one happens to be somewhere in the Caribbean. What we have here are a bunch of pipes, and most hyperbaric facilities will have kilometers of pipes by the time you add all the piping work up together. But we have pipes containing air, sometimes mixed gases, sometimes oxygen, and then in some cases a blanketing gas like nitrogen, so we can have an inert gas being piped inside there. If we have a leak, and we don't know about the leak, then we can have a fire hazard, we can have an asphyxiation hazard, or we can lose the gas in our system, and when we come to turn on that system, we find that our fire deluge system won't fire up because there is no pressure in the line. So there are definite mechanical hazards, there are fire hazards, and there are health hazards if we don't actually pay attention to that. And leak testing was one of the big issues we came up with. People tend to disregard it because what can really happen with a leak if you don't do your leak testing, but if you look at the risk score, it actually becomes a fairly profound risk. This is what happens when you mix seawater with steel. And seawater comes into the chamber because the diver comes in wet from the sea. They put them in the chamber. That goes and sits underneath the deck plates or behind the portholes. And if they don't do their maintenance correctly, the next time you open that up, that's what you see. The chamber's not going to explode. It's going to take a long time before that will lead to a mechanical failure, but it will no longer seal and clearly needs to be fixed, and there are a whole bunch of cost impacts that go with that. And that very telling picture sitting over there is in a first world hospital in a clinical hyperbaric facility. If you pick up, you can't see the deck plate very clearly there. If you lift up the floor plate in the chamber, that's mostly human waste. Skin, hair, fluids and other things clearly not cleaned on a regular basis. And heaven knows what sort of bacteria can germinate inside there. And very often the facilities are just not aware of these issues. No one's taken them step by step through the facility and said, listen, these are the areas that you need to focus on. Forget about the technical stuff. That's very well taken care of. These are the things you should be doing as the medical practitioner, as the staff managing the facility. When we tabulate the safety concerns in terms of their magnitude, they're the top 10. The number's not important, but they're just how they came out. You can see the frequency of occurrence over here as a percentage. There's the number of times they occurred, together with the 95% confidence index interval, and the value of the risk score. And the value of the risk score went from 33 being the highest to about 1 being the lowest. And from that, relative to the other issues, you can get a fairly good idea which are the most important issues that we need to focus on. On my last slide, I'll talk a little bit about some of the detail on these things, why we're concerned about these issues, but it gives us a fairly good spread. Most of those are human interface issues. Very few of them are actually purely technical issues. Can I stop there and ask, has anybody got any specific questions on the data? I don't know how much of the data you want me to discuss.
Just one question, Francois. All of the data that was collected was essentially objective by you. In other words, there's no self-assessment involved in the collection of this data. People didn't say what they were doing.
No.
You looked at what they were doing. You physically examined the chambers. You looked at the valves, looked at the procedure logbooks. No one told you.
I took personally a snapshot on the day of the assessment.
Yes.
If I had help, the help would be collecting information for me, going to find information, but every bit of data that was collected came from me.
Yeah.
When I did the analysis, however, I completely de-identified it. So I had no idea what chamber I was looking at. I just simply looked at how many times these things happened and in what order they came out.
The data itself is first-hand.
It's a snapshot taken by me on that particular date. The other point to note is that many of the chambers were then going to fix some of the things afterwards. I wasn't interested in what they improved in terms of this thesis. I wanted to know from the first snapshot how things actually appeared. What has in reality happened is many of those things have been fixed over time as the awareness has grown. I'm just trying to think if there are any of these that really need to be explained. I don't want to get technical now. I really want to. And the interesting thing of all of these risks is that there's a medical aspect to it, and there's a part that once you explain to the medical practitioner what the issue is, they don't have to be technically minded. They can say, now I understand. I have an electrical safety here. That means my equipment can go down or it can electrocute somebody. That's why I need to have the equipment. Not because the standard said I had to have it. And that's always been our biggest drawback with standards. They don't tell you why you need it. Once a person is convinced as to the why, what is the risk, it's much easier to get them to comply or to then eliminate that risk completely. Then we came to the interesting part of the analysis, and that was looking at the associated factors. And I knew they had impact somewhere. The difficulty in the beginning, looking at all the data, was to say, well, how do you correlate this to the risks? And only once I had risk scores and risk assessment scores per facility could I then start to correlate the age. If the chamber is 50 years old or if the chamber is 5 years old, is there a difference in the safety pattern? And intuitively we might have some thoughts about why it is, but we needed to see what the data actually told us. Okay, what we then did is did basic regression analysis to compare the different elements of these associated factors and see in terms of age, how important is it significant? And in fact, age tended to be not significant. I'm not going to obviously go through them all now, but the really important ones, the important one for me, because it's one that comes up very often when I'm at a chamber in a remote location, run by a bunch of ex-commercial divers, is we don't really need a doctor. And I desperately want some way to convince these people that actually you do need a doctor. Maybe not physically on site continuously during the second and third treatment, but certainly as you start the process. And so that one had significant outcomes. If we don't have a doctor committed to the program, our safety levels are horrendous. If we do have a doctor, our safety levels improve dramatically. And many of these associated factors, 9 of them came up with really significant outcomes. Taking all of that together, and this was kind of the last bit of magic that Jack helped to make happen, was to produce a linear model that said if I ask a facility 4 very simple, non-judgmental questions, they're not likely to give me any other answer other than the truth, I can have a fairly good feeling about that chamber without ever having seen it. Just to look at some of in terms of the data and the significance of these associated factors, I've just got 4 slides to share with you instead of the whole range of them. But this one looks at something that comes up very often in remote facilities for no medical reason, but for insurance reasons, is how often is this chamber used? Because with utilization, some people believe the cost of treatment should be a direct relation to how often a chamber is used. And with deference to our colleagues in the United States of America, they don't believe that's the truth. They believe if a chamber treats 1 or 0 or 100 patients a year, the cost should still be fixed, and that's not a realistic way to look at things. But purely on a safety aspect or on a risk aspect, when we have a patient treating less than 5 patients per year, we can see we have a relatively high risk assessment score. And when we have a facility treating 50 or more patients per year, we can see a significant improvement in the safety score. Now, these are absolutely not absolute values, because in each of these categories you'll find facilities that are really top-notch and facilities that are really rock bottom, but you can see the trends, and statistically the differences are significant. Another one that is very interesting, it's actually not as difficult as it sounds to get the information across to people out there, is training. Many of the facilities believe that they would like to have some formal, internationally recognized training for their staff, not only to give them credibility, but also for those staff members to have when they move on somewhere else, they can take training with them that is actually applicable. But we have a fairly good spread between informal or on-the-job training at a facility where a person arrives, a chamber tender arrives to work at a facility, gets trained on the job, which is very good training. On-the-job training means you learn to use that exact chamber with all of its particular idiosyncrasies, different types of valves, different types of instruments, so your training is actually normally top-notch. However, it's not formally recognized, meaning that most of the time you haven't been examined correctly, you might not meet the entry requirements, you might not have the necessary abilities to deal with patients that go into distress. But we had a look at the correlation. You can see here significantly again, informal or actually no training differ vastly from formal training. So it's a very, very, very good push for those of us involved in international training to make sure that these facilities buy into the program. Level of medical supervision is not as telling as one would have thought. That's partially because in the case of no doctor, we didn't have many chambers to actually assess, or not many of the chambers actually present with that. But there still is a significant trend showing you that if we have a full-time doctor at the facility, it generally means we have commitment and interest and passion from that doctor. And when you have that, most of the time your safety levels are vastly improved. Clearly you can't change the technical side, so the safety is coming from the operational safety in practice at the facility. And then the last of the slide of the things to show you, which we didn't use in our final model, but it's a question that comes up, and a question that gets asked of Divers Alert Network and of doctors very often is, well, what treatment pressure is the best treatment pressure for an injured diver? Now, this is not a medical discussion. This is purely looking at what are the safety levels at a typical oxygen-type treatment table, so they're treating on what they call a US Navy Table 6. That's the most common treatment given to an injured diver. We have a more sophisticated COMEX table, the COMEX 50, which is a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen given to the patient. And then we have this, France always has good description for these words. It's something that came in for the past. Some people absolutely believe that if you have a diver that was injured with a bubble at a very great depth, you should take him down as deep as possible. And if I were to say this in front of people like Richard Moon and other people, he would be swearing at me from the audience by now, because they really believe that this is a very dangerous area to be in. If something goes wrong with a patient at this depth, you have so many other technical issues and operational issues that you can't cope with, we shouldn't be looking at them. But even between a COMEX 30 and the oxygen table, we see that if you stick to the basic oxygen treatment table, you can cover 99% of your diving injuries, and you have a better chance of having a facility that is actually safer. The higher the pressure, the more complexity, the more likelihood there is to be a safety incident at that facility. Okay, taking all this data, putting it together, we used a multiple regression model, and we essentially put down a linear model that says if we have 4 basic parameters, and the parameters are listed over here, we can ask the facility, what type of chamber do you have? Is it a monoplace or multiplace? There's no judgment in that. You just tell it what chamber you use. And actually, from the Divers Alert Network, we don't really mind as long as we have medical supervision. How often do you treat people per year? So if it's in a hospital treating hundreds of patients per year, or if it's in the Galapagos Islands treating 1 patient per year, we need to know what sort of spread you have in terms of patients. Is the training done on-site informally, which is in most of the cases in a remote area the case? Or do we have formal training? In other words, your staff are registered with the National Board, they write external exams. And is the chamber open 24/7, or is it only based during office hours? And from those 4 questions, we can get a 95% confidence of the risk assessment score of that chamber that we've never seen. They have no idea what equipment they have, what sort of pipe work, what sort of maintenance regimen, what sort of treatment depths they use, what their medical supervision is. We already know in which direction we're heading. One of the parameters we looked at and we didn't bring into the model was the chamber rating. We came to this happened several years ago. We essentially rate chambers in terms of an A to an F. And the ABCD is not a quality assessment. It just says it's in a hospital, it can deal with critical care cases, or it's outside a hospital and it can only treat to 3 atmospheres or do an oxygen treatment table. That's really just a classification, A, B, C, or D. But E and F were the times where, as the assessor, I believe that in an E, a doctor would have to make a very specific decision to allow treatment at that chamber because there were significant safety issues. And an F, and there were only 2 Fs in the entire spectrum, was please do not send patients to that treatment, to that facility. That facility is, and many of them are still currently treating patients, but they are horrendous. No windows, no analyzers, really there are accidents waiting to happen, and they have accidents, and they don't even report what those accidents are. But that was a very interesting model to use, and one would think that model would find a place here. But there's too much collinearity between the information you use to determine those gradings and this information here, so we left it out. And in fact, we don't really need it. We already have a fairly good feeling for where we're going with the data that we have. That's really what the model looks like when we put the results out, and I don't want to throw thousands of figures at you here, but you can see the basic coefficient that you'd use in getting your final score. So if you're looking at your chamber type, a monoplace chamber being the reference, then you'd either use a factor of 144 or 77, depending on the type of chamber they actually have. If it's a monoplace chamber, then the value is 0. And you go through your 4 parameters, you add up your 4 coefficients, you'll come out with your final risk assessment score for that particular facility that you haven't seen. So a fairly simple way to go about it, and can be done very easily by the on-call medic that is actually trying to investigate, trying to plan for where that patient might need to be sent. Okay. First on the list of conclusions, really, that I believe is important for me as the person undertaking this entire venture was the validation that this risk assessment process actually comes up with meaningful, real, useful data. I know from a personal level, having visited these chambers, I can see the impact it has on the people operating the chamber. It's essentially an education and empowerment process, and when we finished, the facility feels, now I know, now I understand, and now I can deal with these issues. But this really validated it in terms of looking at the data. We came up with a simple linear model giving us a fairly high confidence level of what the safety level could be at a facility that we have not yet seen. And there are facilities coming on stream continuously, so this is something that happens. We now know which are the safety areas we need to really focus on and maybe provide education programs and do further research on. And that it is the human interface and not the technical side that is key to safety. So you need to plan correctly, you need to plan for your staff changeover, you need to train your staff correctly, you need to be aware, and your safety regimen at your facility is always going to be much higher. Where do we go with this information? Well, we know that the risk scores and the risk assessment scores are absolutely not absolute values, they are relative values, and there's certainly enough scope there to find other means of assessing these using more well-known occupational, medical, or industrial indices and computations, and maybe we can come up with a more absolute scoring. I don't believe it's necessary within the context of remote recreational facilities, but certainly could be of use in clinical hyperbaric facilities and elsewhere. And of course there might be other associated factors that we could find that could help us to improve the accuracy of the model. So there are areas for further research. And then specifically from the top 5 findings that we came up with, interesting that the most, and when I ask people the question, what do you think is the most important finding, they always come up with a technical issue. Chambers don't look after their windows, or they don't have a safety valve. The fact is they don't practice their emergency drills. And there are a couple of good, for those of you that watch movies, a couple of good movies out there. I think it's called Widowmaker, the K-90, the submarine, where Harrison Ford gets on this Russian submarine. The first thing he does is run through the emergency drills, and it's total havoc. These are well-trained submariners, but they don't practice the safety drills, and of course, that's when things go wrong. Far better for it to go wrong during your drill than for it to go wrong when you actually are called to rely on that fire deluge system. So what one needs, I've done some of the research already. We really need to understand why is it important, what are the other areas in medicine where this is done similarly, and then convince the medical practitioners why they need to have an active drill program at their facility. And if we can just, France, share with what we found at a facility when we did our facility at Eugene Marais, we had a fire button on the wall of the facility, and we decided one day to actually activate that fire button to make sure that the alarm went off, to make sure it works during a drill. And when Sarita took off the cover to the fire alarm, nothing happened. That fire alarm had never even been wired up. We just assumed that in an emergency, we'd break the glass and the fire alarm would go off, and clearly that was not going to happen. And you'd never know until you actually practice your drills. Alternative breathing device for the chamber operator. That means that the chamber operator can remain at his or her station if there's a fire in the building, if there's smoke in the building, if there's any other reason for an unbreathable atmosphere, and safely get the patients out of the chamber. So very often the chambers have no alternative breathing apparatus available. And it's not just a question of the fact that you need to have something, but what do you need to have? What are the likely products of combustion? What type of device should you have? How long do you need to be at your station? There's a fair amount of work that can be done in finding the most optimum solution to that. I think sometimes, to the embarrassment of the medical practitioners, we find at many of these facilities that especially the emergency medical procedures are completely undocumented. And I know that I will pick up some criticism when I say this, because the doctors will say to me, no, we know exactly what to do. But when I ask that doctor that's there on locum at the particular chamber in the Maldives, and I say to her, so what would you do? First answer she says to me is, no, the doctor's got that in a file somewhere. And I say, you can't be looking for files when you have a medical emergency in the chamber. And how it turns out eventually is there's no written document that tells them how you deal with those medical emergencies in the chamber. It is different when you have an emergency in a chamber to when you're dealing with a medical emergency elsewhere. I spoke already about leak testing of pipework. Very simple thing to do, but understanding the impact and how it can impact on the safety regimen is what we want to try and convey there. And then finally, on maintenance, and it's a topic that I do present to medical people on, why do we even have to worry about maintenance? Well, a hyperbaric chamber is not just a chamber. It is a set of compressors, high-pressure cylinders, air conditioning system, gas analyzers, gauges, chamber, and a whole bunch of other things. And as such, when they put together, the contractors will buy these different items or make them and put them together. So there will be no such thing as a maintenance manual that covers that entire facility. The biggest gap we have is that the maintenance is largely undefined, because people know how to take care of individual items, but they can't take care of the facility as a whole. And it's certainly an area of further research that we can look at. I think that's my 45 minutes up, so please, I'd like you to fire your questions away if you have any.
Jack, I think we should give the external examiner the first opportunity.
Yeah, the proposal is that you ask a few questions, if you've got a few questions, as external examiner.
Yes, please. Do you hear me at the moment?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So first of all, I have to say that this was a very important work, because it was a very practical point of view which is behind this work, and we spent hours and hours discussing any single factor which lies behind the safety of the hyperbaric facilities. But Francois looked at the whole facility, so I do believe that this is very important. I have two questions and one comment at the end. First, Francois, have you had any opportunity to cross-check the risk assessment score against any real accident in the chamber, which unfortunately occurs from time to time?
Okay,
it would be very interesting to see this data for, let's say, negative situations.
Jacek, I can answer that, and thank you for the question, because it's something I omitted to say right in the beginning. When we devised the risk assessment system, once I essentially highlighted all the areas of risk in a facility, and specifically now as published in the Risk Assessment Guide, I took the 73 analysis of real chamber fires that we knew in 1996 had happened, and every one of those fires I analysed against the Risk Assessment Guide to make sure that we knew that if you follow the risk assessment process, then every single one of those fires could have been avoided. In terms of actual correlation now, I haven't statistically or analytically looked at especially the last 10 or 12 years of fires to see whether they could have been avoided and what sort of risk score or how it could affect the risk score itself. Because intuitively, when we designed the risk assessment system, and in terms of determining the probability and the likelihood of those exposures happening, I sit on the committee that looks at these fires, and we bring that information in real terms into every single risk assessment that we do. But from a scientific or a data point of view, the answer would be no. We haven't done that on any data form as yet.
Yes, but the most important for me is your practical answer that you did it personally. So I mean that in future it will be used in any case of investigation concerning any accident if this happens.
Absolutely.
The second question is that if we all agree that risk assessment score is a tool, and in order to use it correctly, we need to know how to use it and how to interpret the final readout of this tool. So the question is, do you have any idea, even knowing that the risk assessment score is a little bit of relative value, but do you have any idea what should be the cutoff for any hyperbaric facility which one could describe as a safe one, as a safe hyperbaric facility?
It's a difficult question to answer, Jacek, because you can score something with a fairly low score or a high score, but it's going to vary between the facilities, because unfortunately the one confounding factor is the commitment and awareness of the staff at that facility, and that can change. So I'm always very hesitant in making statements like that. But what I have done up until now is I've essentially come up with a 4-point rating system, or a level 1 risk, which means that you have to address that risk. If you don't address that risk, that chamber should not be running. And then level 2, level 3, level 4 will just take you through the various grey areas. So level 2, you need to be aware of that, and you can find alternative means of mitigating that risk, but you still have to be aware of it. And a level 4 would be a nice to have. It's not going to really affect your actual safety at the facility. And that's about as much as I've been prepared to commit myself, because I'm very aware of variable interpretation of people of numbers. And I don't really want to give a number to something and then somebody says, well, you gave it a low number, but we just eventually end up killing 3 people in that chamber. So we have a grading system of 1 to 4, which I'm fairly confident to use. I know that level 1 risks, if you don't address them, they are going to lead most definitely to an accident. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. This is the final answer for this, and I'm fully aware that still there is some kind of the subjective interpretation of the final outcome, as depending strongly also for which purposes the hyperbaric facility will be used. Either it is military, professional, or recreational as well. Okay, so you answered correctly my to questions, and I'm not quite sure whether I will have opportunity later on, but I would like to conclude and congratulate this work, because in my opinion this is the excellent work, and this simply shows that you are not only the professionalist in the job but also enthusiast for this job. That's why I would like to congratulate also not only the work by itself but also the presentation. Okay, so for me at the moment is thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you, Jacek.
Francois, yes, thank you very much for a well-rounded presentation. I think your presentation fits in very well with your dissertation, which was also a very good piece of work. Some months ago, Jack asked me if I would be the internal examiner for this dissertation, and I was a little bit hesitant. I'm the only medic around here with no background in this specific field where you guys are working, and so I felt a little bit unsure of myself. But the way that you explained your topic and your findings in your dissertation and today during your presentation made it so much easier for me anyway to understand. There's one thing that I felt missing from your dissertation, and also today from your presentation, I would like specifically to ask you about it, and that is, how are you going to communicate your findings? You've very often mentioned that this is going to be of great value to different groupings, but you need to communicate these findings. It's valuable, it's going to add a lot of value, I'm pretty sure about it, but you must tell me how you're going to do it.
Certainly in two ways. Firstly, the intention, and this is kind of, we got to a point during the actual process with Jack where I was going in a direction, I would have answered your question, and Jack said, no, if we go in that direction now, you're going to take away the full value of where this model took us. The important safety aspects that I listed, those 10 over there, my intention is, and the 5 of them I've actually researched already, I've written them up in a proper scientific form, and what the intention is to publish those things in peer-reviewed journal. So this is something that I think Jacek is very keen for me to do, is firstly perhaps publish a summary of the dissertation in one of the international diving journals so that I can set the scene, and then follow that up with 5 or 6 peer-reviewed journals on each of those significant findings, so that the medical practitioners out there can see, they can understand the background, why and how identified what those were, why it is an issue, and how they, as people that are generally non-technical, can actually take care of that responsibility. The medical practitioner in most countries is the person responsible for the outcome of the patient and anything that goes wrong with the patient. And yet the medical practitioner is very often hamstrung because they don't have either the knowledge or the authority to deal with some of these safety issues. And what my intention is to communicate to them how they can take on that responsibility, not by technical knowledge, but by management and by understanding what the issues are. So the answer to the question is to publish these things internationally, and then if I'm invited to then speak on them. And I generally tend to speak at about 5 or 6 international meetings or faculty meetings per year. So I tend to get out to Europe and to the States. So I think there will be opportunity to present this, and that is the intention.
Do you think of possibly exploring the possibility of speaking to insurance companies, especially those insurance companies involved in insuring the hyperbaric facilities?
That's a very good point to bring now. I haven't thought about it in what you're referring to now, but we actually do generally speak to the insurance companies from the medical side to assure them that the risk of diving is actually less than they think. But with insurance, of course, is split into two. There's equipment insurance, and then there's the medical liability insurance, and obviously to pay for the accidents. And I certainly, let me try and answer it this way. When I was doing a presentation last year in the States, I was approached by an insurance company in the States that wants to speak to me more about this so they can actually better define the risks when they're underwriting the risks. And it's not related to this, but to show you how the word gets around, I was also approached, and I can't say too much about it here, by a legal team to then provide expert input into a court case ongoing hyperbaric accident in the States. So those are the best places for me to actually produce this information, and that's where the insurance people actually go to find the information. We've had insurance people at the EBS meetings, we've had them at the UHMES meetings. They come to that body of knowledge to find where they can get enough information to mitigate the risks that they have to insure, to quantify the underwriting risk that they have. So that's actually a good point to add to when we go and see the underwriters that we speak to fairly regularly, to tell them that we actually have quantitatively understood better what the risks are. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jack.
Any questions from others?
It's not a question, but it's just an idea. Why you can use the portable monoplate chamber in the very remote places? Can it be of help? I don't know if it's quite efficient, but
Okay.
I read about it.
Yes, that's not a difficult question to answer. In fact, Divers Alert Network South Africa owns a portable chamber, but we have decided not to send it out to a remote area. The problem is the question of, once you make yourself available to do that, you then have to take the full ramification of that. 90% of the time we prefer to evacuate that person to a medical facility somewhere, to a clinic, evaluate them medically, and then decide on how we're going to treat them after that. So in theory, and certainly one person in this audience has actually flown with a chamber and actually gone and done the treatment on site. It can be done, but there are a lot of complexities that go with that. A lot of planning has to go into it, and then you buy this chamber, which costs maybe $1 million, $1.5 million, and you use it 3 or 4 times, and you know that those chambers last 10 years. And after 10 years, the windows have to be replaced, and very often the Kevlar itself has to be replaced. So it's a question of wisdom responsibility and feasibility, financial feasibility. But there are people that are making one in Canada at the moment that have asked me for my input into their design, whether it's feasible. It's feasible for commercial diving companies. It's definitely feasible for the military. But for civilian recreational diving cases, we don't believe so at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other question?
Francois, I just want a clarifying question. The chamber or recompression chamber table depth rating, was that based on the actual tables that chambers did use, or the capability that the facilities had and could use?
Yes. France, it's quite straightforward to answer. I can walk into a chamber and see what the safety valve is set for, so I know what they could do. I ask the question, what do you treat? And they say, we treat table 6, COMEX 50, and table 6A. Even if they've never done one, they say, we are ready to do a table 6A. They believe they are.
There's a commitment up to that level.
Correct. So you would then, if you make a referral to the facility, you'd refer to them and say, but you say that you can, and therefore I need you to actually perform that treatment.
I've just made some notes as you went along, and maybe just to summarize some of the impressions that I had, and I hope that that would be of value. Firstly, I think that the fact that you polled firsthand the majority of remote recompression facilities in the world is extraordinary, because that means that the data and the conclusions apply and are reflected in the narrow confidence intervals, which really makes the model rather robust and very useful. The approach that you followed in determining that the environment was secure using the German system, the maintenance was effective using the Navy system, the operations were sound using the UHMS system, the fires would be prevented based on the NFPA, but also your review of the 75-year analysis, and that the manufacture was appropriate using the various manufacturing systems, means that all of those elements were integrated in the development of this. You then produced a holistic assessment looking at safety and risk, but with the idea to prevent a risk outcome, of which one of the most profound findings was that formal training would reduce the risk scores by half and provide immediate justification for a tremendous international thrust into that, which I would strongly wish to campaign for, in which the core outline should address the non-compliance areas, focus on core competencies, and be produced in a way that would be most accessible to the facilities. And taking Sydney's comment on the insurance, the principle of having a driver in the form of insurance premium reductions or premium returns based on good behavior could produce a very, very good ecosystem around enhancing and promoting good behavior. Taking Jacek's comment, I think to look at how chambers have been categorized in terms of how Dan might view them, compared to what the risk assessment scores would be as a scattergram or correlation, I think could nevertheless be a useful thing to do, bearing in mind that an experienced individual can use an old clunker more safely than an incompetent person would use a Rolls Royce. So bearing that in mind, I think that there would be merit in doing that sort of correlation. Developing absolute scores by even retrospectively applying this system where an accident occurs, I think, as Jacek mentioned, could have merit. And again, I think that the asset that this is in being able to provide a scaffolding for the improvement of safety in hyperbaric medicine, although targeted on remote chambers, but ultimately to spill over to regular clinical hyperbaric medicine, is extraordinary. And I don't just say this as your friend, I say this because I view this from the perspective of having been in this field for more than 2 decades. So I want to congratulate you for that.
Thank you.